Good evening and welcome to the 2021 Winter Webinar Series, COVID-19 Addressing Needs and Resilience, sponsored by American Baptist Women's Ministries. My name is Reverend Dr. Gina Jacob Strain, and I serve as the Executive Director for American Baptist Women's Ministries. We are so pleased that each of you has joined us this evening, and we hope this webinar will provide for you useful knowledge and resources. Let us pray. Tonight, I will pray a prayer for us from Ephesians 1:18 through 21. And it says this: "And I pray that the eyes of your heart, the very center and core of your being, may be enlightened, flooded with light by the Holy Spirit, so that you will know and cherish the hope, the divine guarantee, the confident expectation to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, God's people, and so that you will begin to know what the immeasurable and unlimited and surpassing greatness of his active spiritual power is in us who believe. These are in accordance with the working of his mighty strength, which he produced in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his own right hand in the heavenly places. May God bless the hearing and reading of his holy word. Amen." So just in case this is your first time attending one of our webinars, we especially welcome you. AB Women's Ministries is a Christ-centered ministry with a commitment to encourage and empower women and girls to serve God. ABWM is a diverse, intergenerational community of American Baptist women and girls serving in ministry in Christ's name in the U.S., including Puerto Rico. With local, area, region, state, and national levels of ministry, American Baptist Women's Ministries strives to create and sustain communities of passionately faithful, mission-minded women and girls engaged in worship, service, and friendship. Our ministries include education and prevention of sex trafficking, mission with women and girls, immigration, cross-cultural relationships, economic empowerment, sex trafficking, advocacy, and addiction. Please go to our website, www.abwomensministries.org, to find out more about our wonderful ministries and more about the events and things that are coming up. I now turn it over to my colleague, Reverend Lathelma Yin-Bata, our Associate Executive Director.
Thank you so much, Gina. Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to share with you our guidelines for your time with us on the webinar. You'll be muted throughout the presentation. However, you may raise your raise hand icon. You may use it during question and answer or even throughout the presentation. You may type your question into the question box in your control panel. If you see a question written that is close to your question or is your question, you can upvote the question to emphasize another person's question, and we will address that one first. Lastly, but certainly not least, please complete the survey so that we can continue providing you with outstanding webinars. So before we turn it over to our wonderful presenter, I would love for us to complete this poll. This is a women's, as everyone must know, this is Women's History Month. And so I just want to test your knowledge. So please check out the poll, just 4 questions, and we'll see how many we get correct. There we go. I was wondering, I was like, well, you really think you're hard. But now I see the results are coming in. Okay, I'll give a few more minutes and then we'll see how we did. Okay, I'm gonna all right, so I'm gonna show us how we did. All right, so let's see how we did. Number one, which Mexican American woman has repeatedly been the leading money winner in the Ladies Professional Golf Association? Yes, 82% of us said Nancy Lopez, 15% believe it's Romana Banuelos, 3% believe it's Jennifer Lopez, and 0% believes it's March Fung Ngu. All right, 82% of us are correct. It is Nancy Lopez. What former slave was a powerful speaker for the rights of women and Black people? This is a tough one because I agree with your selection. So 59% believe Harriet Tubman, 38% said Sojourner Truth, 3% said Shirley Chisholm, and 0% said Alice Paul. You know what? That's a tough one. I think Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Shirley Chisholm could have been the right answer. So really, it was supposed to be Sojourner Truth because of her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" But I agree with you all. It could be either three. All right, number three. When was the Equal Rights Amendment first introduced into Congress? Was it 1923? Was it 1930? 2000? None of you believe that. Or 1990? 33% of us believe that. Well, the correct answer is 1923. All right, last question. Who was the Shoshone Indian woman who served as a guide and interpreter on the Lewis and Clark expedition? All right, is it Pocahontas? Nope. Is it Shan Chun-Wu? No. Sacagawea? I think that sounds about right. 79% of us got that correct. All right, you all did a fantastic job. Give yourselves a round of applause. Even though we can't see you, but we are clapping and celebrating your women's history knowledge. And even if you didn't know, now you know. So hope you learned something new tonight. All right. Well, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our presenter for this evening. It is Linda Furness. She specializes in executive coaching and leadership development. And most recently, she spent 6 years at Google, where she coached hundreds of leaders across the organization. Before joining Google, she was a partner at a coaching and leadership development firm, where she designed and delivered comprehensive feedback and coaching programs for leadership teams at the Hewlett Foundation and the Packard Foundation. Other clients have included Apple, Bain Company, McKinsey, ClimateWorks Foundation, Davis Polk and Wardwell, Natural Resources Defense Council, and numerous startups. You all, we have someone really great with us today. Prior to becoming a full-time executive coach, Linda served as the head of human resources for Financial Engines, Inc., a firm founded by Nobel laureate Bill Sharp. She has also held HR roles at Virtual Law Partners, Netscape, and Hewlett Packard, and was a litigation consultant with Cornerstone Research. Linda received her BA from UC Berkeley, a JD from Stanford Law, and coaching certifications from CTI and Immunity to Change. Linda lives in California's Coastal Range with her family and her zoo, and finds joy in redwoods every day. Without further ado, I turn it over to Linda.
Thank you, Latona. Yep, my zoo. I love my animals. We always try to keep the ratio of animals a little higher than the people. So I'm so happy to be here with you tonight. And I just want to say before I jump in that when Lethelma and Gina first asked me to come and talk with you about leading in COVID, my initial thought was, wow, that's really broad. I don't know what would be most helpful. And I sent a little survey, which some of you responded to, thank you. And the answers were really different, right, in terms of the challenges you face. But what was consistent, not super surprisingly, the common thread was about leading through times of a lot of change. So I'm going to bring up, let's see, bring up my presentation, which is going to be when things are changing. And not just changing, but changing, new, unknown, unpredictable, which is really, I think, where we all are right now. COVID has been very much this way. And you know, there's always an element of this, I think. But this last year, especially, there's been so much of it. So I'm going to try to spend about 20 to 25 minutes or so taking you through some content about this, and then have a lot of time for Q&A, because I really like, as Lethelma said, I really like to just answer questions and interact with you. So, so please do share questions, thoughts, what lands for you, what doesn't. I would love to know. Okay. So first, what we're going to do is spend a little bit of time talking about a model, which I think is useful in understanding how to think about any situation you're in, and in particular, when there's a lot of unpredictability. So the model we're going to go through is one that was developed by a guy named Dave Snowden, and it's called the Canevan Framework, which is a Welsh word that means domains or habitats. So it's sort of a way of looking around at any situation and getting a sense of what is going on here. Am I in a predictable space or an unpredictable space? And what he means by that, in the predictable world, you can know that if I do X, Y is going to happen, right? It's repeatable, it's reliable, it's consistent. We can predict that. In the unpredictable space, I don't know what's going to happen if I do X. Maybe it'll be Y, maybe it'll be P, maybe it'll be Q. I'm not sure. And so there's a way of sort of looking at any situation and differentiating, where do I think I am? And then he broke it down a little further within each of those to say, okay, in the predictable space, there's the simple part of the predictable world where cause and effect are really obvious. So in this space, if you do the right steps in the right order, you're going to get the same result. So it's like baking a cake, right? If I use the right ingredients in the right amount and I put them together the right way and I have a temperature, it's going to work out pretty much most of the time. Cause and effect are really kind of obvious and direct. And there's a right way to do things, right? Following the recipe, it will work. If I decide I'm suddenly going to do twice as much liquid in my cake, it's not going to work. So that's what simple domain of the predictable space is like. And then he talks about the complicated part of the predictable space. And in the complicated domain, cause and effect are more complicated. So you might need experts to figure something out. You might need a lot of research or analysis, right? Experts might disagree about the very best way to do things, but you can still know what's going to work and what's not going to work, right? So building a skyscraper is an example of that, right? It's a lot more complicated than baking a cake. But we have the information, we can get the information. We do know what will work. And maybe, you know, you could do it this way or that way. Maybe there's multiple good ways, not just one way, but it is something, again, where you can be confident that if you follow the right steps, it's going to work, right? So that's the predictable space. And then he compares that to in the unpredictable space, where you don't know that A will lead to B. He talks about, again, two domains. The first one is the complex space. And in complexity, cause and effect can only be figured out looking backwards. So, and the reason for that is there are so many interconnecting things that move in variable ways that we just can't know on the front end what's going to happen. So one example of that might be in a rainforest, right? It's a really complex system. So let's say, I don't know, it goes into a rainforest and they hunt all the frogs of a certain type of frog, and they take out all the frogs. We don't know what will happen. Maybe we don't know that those frogs are the only thing that eats this certain kind of bug, and that bug is the only thing that eats this certain kind of plant. And when we take out the frogs, the bugs go crazy and they wipe out all those plants, and that causes something else, right? There's just too many variables to know. Another example of the complex space are people. So while you can know that in general, if you do certain things, we're going to like it or not like it, etc. If you want to get a person to do a thing or get a person to change a behavior, you can't be sure what you can do that will cause that, right? Even sometimes if it's yourself, you can't be sure. But certainly with other people, and certainly with people in organizations or groups, that's very true. So, if you wanted to get me to do a certain thing, you might have some good ideas about what you could try, but you aren't going to know for sure what will work until you try them, right? So in this space, you can't know ahead of time what will work, which means there isn't a right answer, yeah? And then in the fourth space that he talked about, which is the place of chaos, chaotic space, this is where you really can't see any cause and effect. You don't know why things are happening, and you can't figure it out. Even in hindsight, you still don't know why it happened. So an earthquake or a natural disaster is a good example of that. It's so complex, we just don't know. And so this is a way of looking at any situation and trying to make sense of where you are in this snap, right, of these different domains. And often it's the case that any given situation might have multiple parts in different places, right? So there might be some aspects of this situation that are simple, some aspects that are complicated, and some aspects that are complex. That can often be true. And these are sort of wavy lines here because it's not like a hard and fast black and white division between things. It's a little fuzzy. And it's a little fluid. So something that starts out as complex, if we learn enough about it, may become just complicated. So that can happen. So let's see what else I want to say about that. Yeah. So the question is then, how does knowing this help with leading, right? So this model has implications for what leaders should do, particularly when you look at the complicated versus complex spaces. So let me talk you through that. I'm going to focus more on those two, although I'll mention the others. But complex and complicated is where we probably spend most of our time, right? And that's certainly where we often have the most challenge. So chaotic is really rare and simple is more straightforward. So looking first again at the predictable side, here, where cause and effect are clear and there is a right answer to be found, whether it's simple or complicated, a lot of the things that you would normally think of as typical sort of managing behaviors show up, right? So when things are simple, you just need to tell people what you need them to do and let them do it. Maybe there's some teaching, right? But it's communicating, delegating, things like that. In the complicated space, you might need to do a lot of research or a lot of analysis. You consult with experts, you do forecasting and planning and monitoring and adjusting, right? All of which sound like sort of typical management-y things. And those work. They're really, really useful when that's what you're dealing with. But in the unpredictable space, where you can't know what will happen, those things, it turns out, aren't helpful. You actually need to approach things in a totally different way. And if you're trying to use a complicated approach to a complex situation or the complex part of a situation, you're going to end up really frustrated because you're trying to do something that can't work. So what do you do in complexity? So because you can't know in advance what's going to work, What you need to do is work in an emergent way instead. So what does that mean? So what it means is getting an idea of the direction you're trying to move things in, right? I want to get more people to come to this meeting, or I want to, get people aligned around this idea or something like that. But you don't make a specific plan of exactly like, I'm going to do these steps and it's going to go this way and it's going to take this long, because we don't know, because people are complex. So instead, you set a direction, you try to get a sense of what's going on now, what's working and not working right now with that. And then you try experiments, right? You literally just try things and you see what works. And if it's working, you do it more. And if it's not working, you stop doing that and try something else. So it's a really different approach than the way we would work in the complicated space. And most of us, most of the time, get a lot more in how to sort of live in the predictable world, and not very much information about what's helpful when you're dealing with complexity, even though we spend a lot of time there because we're always dealing with other people. Do you have a question or a comment?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm wrestling with this. So if you are, and I know this is kind of this, we are focusing tonight on the unpredictability connected to COVID, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm just thinking sort of like under normal, I don't know how we define normal, but under normal circumstances, right? When you are in a new environment, mm-hmm. right? Like a new job, right? I feel like that might be kind of complex, like because you're trying to figure out the culture, and then maybe we might overcomplicate it because we're trying to figure out. So I was looking at this and I was thinking like, so what would be your advice to someone in a new situation, like in a new job, a new whatever, when you're trying to figure out mm-hmm. something, and you may find yourself in complex, right? Cause and effect may only be in hindsight. Like you may realize that the coffee mug that you use belonged to your boss, and that probably wasn't the best idea, right? So how do you kind of negotiate that in settings where you're trying to figure out?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. Thank you. Perfect. So I think the first thing is just knowing there's not a single right way to do this can help you let go of trying to find the single right way to do it. Right? So that's the first thing. It's not about there's a right way and I have to find it. That's number one. Number two is where in the complicated space, you might spend a lot of time trying to like figure it all out and also control things. In the complex space, what you want to do more is you still are sort of trying to get information. The sensing what's happening is I'm still trying to get information. So for example, in your example, it might be people come in and get coffee mugs in the morning. Like, how are they doing that, right? Like you want to pay attention, you're sensing, right? Like what's going on. But then you have to just try things. So let's say in that example, I'm trying to learn this and I'm realizing I've made a few missteps, or it seems a little hard to figure out what the right steps are, right? Maybe I try an experiment of buddying up to somebody who's been around a while and I say, hey, can we grab lunch, right? And see if I can learn from them, and does that help? Or maybe another experiment is going back to somebody where I feel like I made a misstep and saying, hey, I'm new and I feel like I kind of made a mistake, and like, can you help me? Right? So you try things and see what works, what doesn't. What kind of reception does that get? Do I get a warm reception? Do people look at me like I just have two heads? Like, what's going on here? Right? So it's simple, and in a way it's stuff we do a lot, but I think the really useful piece here is that very often when we have a challenge that we're trying to solve and it's not getting resolved, right? It feels sticky or hard, or we just can't get through it and we keep trying things. Often what is happening is we're trying to use complicated tactics to solve a complex problem. Oh, and you're still on mute, but I saw you said something.
I'm disagreeing. I'm shaking my head. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. I love it. So, so that's, I think, the biggest thing is realizing like, oh, those trying to control things, those trying to figure things out strategies aren't always going to be the most useful, right? Sometimes we have to do it a different way. So this can be, a lot of times when leaders first get exposed to this, the feeling is like a sense of relief, like all that stuff I was trying to do that wasn't working, it's not my fault. I wasn't failing. I'm not doing it wrong. Woo! It feels better, right? But it feels really uncomfortable that I can't do all those things I normally do to get my arms around something, and they're not going to work for me here. That's kind of unsettling, right? So the trick is human beings just really hate not knowing what's going to happen. We hate being wrong. We hate not having all the answers, right? It's really unsettling. It makes us really uncomfortable. We like predictability. We do not like unpredictability. It makes us very nervous. So the more uncertain things are, the more likely we are to get triggered and go into fight or flight mode, right? And in fight or flight mode, you probably know, part of our brain gets activated where our creativity, our ability to be open and curious, our ability to sort of take risk, all of that just goes, right? That just gets shut down.
Yes, Linda, we actually have some questions about that in our chat, especially about, experimenting when you're dealing with a complex issue. So one of our participants is asking, when you experiment and change, how do you, and it doesn't work, people might think that you're wishy-washy or not a good leader. How do you bring people that you're leading on board with this, with this ideology of, okay, let's experiment, let's play? How do you get people on board with that without them questioning your leadership ability?
Awesome question. Yeah, totally. And part of it is exactly what you just said. It's telling people that that's what you're up to, right? So it's having that conversation to say, we aren't sure, I'm not sure, and we aren't sure what exactly is going to be the right way to go here. So we're going to try some things and we're going to see what works, and we're going to do more of that. So if you can be explicit about what you're up to, I think it can really help, right? Bring people along. Because the truth is, usually when you're in a situation where it's not knowable, where it's not predictable, it's not knowable, people kind of get that, right? They might be trying to find the answer, but another part of them probably knows that there's not just an answer. So I think most people, if you can be transparent and open about, here's the strategy, here's why we're doing it, and you be confident, right? Which again, this requires you not to be in fight or flight mode. And if I'm feeling really afraid of making a mistake and being wrong, this is going to be very, very hard to do, right? But if I can calm myself down to feel like, okay, this makes sense, I think this is the right thing to do, I think this is the approach we're going to take. If I can be calm, it'll help other people, and I can communicate that way. That will help others too.
We have another question. It says, the strategies for the complex quadrant remind me of design thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You see a link there?
Short answer, yes. Yes. And to be full disclosure, I don't know design thinking very well. I've had a tiny bit of exposure to it. I don't know it well. So I would be getting kind of out into territory I don't really know to say much about it. But yes, I do think there's a lot of overlap. Yeah, I think that's true. Okay. So, so let me take us back to, okay, so where are we? Where we are so far is we're saying, okay, so when things are unpredictable, instead of unpredictable, meaning I can't know that A will give me B, right? When that's impossible to know, then instead of trying harder to figure things out, manage things, control things, because it won't work, what I'm saying we need to do instead is feel what's going on, pay attention, sense what's happening, experiment, try some things that you think might be useful. And then whatever's good, do more of that. And whatever's not useful, stop doing it, right? And to the point that was raised by the question, absolutely communicate. This is another whole piece. How do you communicate here? And I think communicating what you're doing and why is super important, so people aren't confused. And also I'll say another thing about the communication piece, which is in complexity, no one person ever has all the information about what's going on, right? So if you're leading a team, you really want and need those people also sensing what's going on, also being eyes and ears, also coming up with experiments. It really needs to be a community effort, right? Because it's too complex for any one person. So part of that is can look like inviting them into that with you, right? So we've got, that's what needs to happen. And then at the same time, as human beings, change and the unknown scare us, they trigger us, they send our nervous system into fight or flight, and all those things we need to be doing get really hard. So now we get to the, okay, what do we do? And the things I'm going to suggest are pretty, not rocket science, but it helps, I think, to have this little bit of background about why they're so especially helpful when things are complex. So the first one is take care of people first, because if people are triggered, nothing's going to work, right? Everything else is just going to be really hard. The curiosity and the openness and the spirit of play that you need is not going to be there. So taking care of people first and starting with yourself, right? Because how you show up as a leader is going to radiate out into how everyone else feels. So some ways to help yourself and other people to calm down and connect. And I know you probably know a million ways to do this. I'm just going to name a few of the things that I think are helpful, knowing that you have tons of other strategies. I'm just going to glance at how I'm doing on time. Okay. I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly, but I want to say this. The very first one, breathe slowly. This is such a superpower for calming down your nervous system and calming down other people's nervous systems. Slow breathing is miraculous. I don't know if you all know this, but if you breathe in for the count of 4, hold it for the count of 4, and then breathe out for the count of 8. So your out breath is twice as long. It's like an instant signal to your nervous system that it's safe and to calm down. It works really quickly. You can do it in a meeting, right? It's just, and I just exaggerated it so you could hear me, but you don't have to make it loud, right? So it's a way to just in the moment, calm yourself down. And because human beings, especially when we're with each other in person, when we get to do that again, we co-regulate with other people. If I calm, other people around me will be calmer. It just works that way. So slow breathing, superpower. Other things that also really help: exercise, not in the moment of the meeting, but beforehand. Pray, meditate, hug a person, cuddle a pet, right? That all tells your nervous system, I'm safe, I'm okay, helps me calm down. Remembering you're not alone. You cannot do this alone, and you're not going to do it alone, right? You're with others. Lean on other people. Let go of the needing to know all the answers, of the having to be right, of the doing it perfectly. The beautiful news is in complexity, you can't, so you might as well let that go. You might start a meeting with a check-in where you just really get a sense of how is everyone right now, right? It doesn't have to take a long time, but it can be a really helpful way to create connection and safety. Remind yourself again, you don't need and you can't have all the answers, so yay for that. Asking people what they need. You can't know what everybody else needs, and it's great for them to get to tell you. It'll tell you things about them. It'll tell you things about what's going on in this whole system. And it'll create connection. And then the last one, and I'll say more about this, is listen. Listening is the other one that I think is a huge superpower in complexity, especially. I think it's a superpower all the time, but especially in complexity, and I'll talk about why. So people first, starting with you, calm everything down. Second big point is knowing your direction. So having a sense of what you want more of, what you want less of, right? Because when things are complicated, only complicated, then you can have a roadmap with a plan and a destination, and we're going to get to here by this time, and these are the metrics, and here's how we're going to do it, and here's how we're going to know we're succeeding, and all of that is really specific, and that's great. But when things are complex, you can't actually do that. The good news is that just knowing I want to go that way, I want to get more people coming and engaging. I don't know exactly what that looks like or exactly when it's going to, but I know that's what I want. That's enough to start designing experiments and moving your way in that direction, right? So a direction is all you have to know, which is also great. Next piece is going back to saying again, the experimenting, play, try things. It's actually the only way to figure out what's going to work because we can't know any other way, which actually is kind of freeing, right? Like, so because we're all just groping around, then we get to go ahead and grope. So that's the experiment piece. And then listening. And I'm going to ask Lathelma and Gina, should I take 5 more minutes to say a piece, say a thing about listening? Or do you want me to not do that?
No, go ahead. Go ahead and say something about listening. We have a couple of questions, but I think go ahead and do that first.
Okay, great. So the thing I want to say about listening, I think listening is a superpower all the time, but especially in complexity. Both because, as we already talked about, it helps with the connecting with yourself and with others. It helps you learn what's happening in the system and get feedback on how your experiments are working. It's just a super valuable tool. And the thing I want to say about listening is not all listening is created equal. So you might check in with yourself to notice, how am I listening? And there's a model I first learned from a group called Cultivating Leadership, where they talk about 3 ways of listening: listening to win, listening to fix, and listening to learn. So I'm just going to say a little bit about each one of those because I think it is very helpful to notice that for yourself. So listening to win can look like this. Listening to win is, I say to my friend, oh my gosh, you cannot believe the day I've had. My kids have been driving me completely crazy. They're like total wild people. It's making me insane. I'm so frustrated. And my friend says, oh my God, you think that's bad? You should hear about my day. That's one kind of listening to win, right? That kind of, you think you've got it bad, let me tell you about me, that one-upmanship, right? That's one kind. There's also more supportive looking kind of listening to win. That is, I say that about my day and my kids driving me crazy and it's been a terrible day. And my friend says, oh, your kids aren't that bad. They're great kids. I'm sure you're exaggerating. So she's being nice. She's trying to support me, kind of. But at the same time, what she's really saying is, you're wrong. I'm right. What you just said isn't true, right? And so in a sense, it's the win part there is sort of her perspective over my perspective, right? Gina, do you want to jump in? Okay. So that's the listening to win, 2 kinds. Listening to fix is a kind of listening that can be really helpful and that we all do a lot of the time, right? This is problem solving. This is, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Let me tell you what worked when my kids were that age and doing the same thing. I tried this, I tried this, I tried this, this worked, don't bother with that, try this, that's listening to fix, right? It's giving advice, it's problem solving, it's I'm gonna help you figure this out. And that can be very helpful, but it doesn't have me, the listener, learn anything more about your situation, right? I'm giving you my advice, I'm not learning from you. And it also doesn't necessarily, sometimes you hit the mark and that's great. And sometimes you kind of miss the mark a little bit and you haven't really addressed the problem exactly. And the person may not feel fully heard by you, right? So what's the alternative? Listening to learn would be, it's where you really are trying to just understand, what is it like for this other person? What is it like to be them in this situation? What is going on for them? So a listening to learn response might be, wow, that sounds really hard. I can hear that you're really frustrated. You want to tell me more about what about that is hardest for you? Right? So I'm just trying to understand, what's it really like over there in your world?
So I have a couple of questions. So I'm going to start with the listen, and then I'll go back to another one.
Great.
Lots of times we're in the habit, right, of listening to fix. Sometimes, depending upon the work environment, we're listening to win, right? Can be kind of competitive. How do we know? How can we help ourselves listen to learn? Like sometimes, someone's talking. I remember years ago, my son said to me, who was trying to explain something to me, that I had the no face before he even finished, so that I wasn't really listening, right? I mean, and I heard what he was saying, and he was right. He was absolutely right. I had sort of made up in my mind already before he had finished the scenario that my answer was going to be no. So it just made me very mindful of that. So sometimes we are listening, but we're not. How can we kind of help ourselves in that way so that we are listening to learn?
That's a great question. And of course, there's not a super simple answer. But what I will say is, so A, just knowing this, right? Knowing this and reminding yourself of this, helpful. You could even like put a sticky note somewhere you'll see it, where you're like listening to win, fix, learn, what am I doing, right? Like you could put it somewhere to remind yourself. But also, when I was talking about the take care of yourself and the breathe slowly, one thing that can help is slowing yourself down, right? Because you're right, it's habit, right? And I think this is so nearly universal. I can't say totally, but it's nearly universal, right? When I first learned this model, I have to say, I was horrified because I thought, oh my gosh, I never listened to her. It was shocking to me how much I didn't do that. And so not expecting yourself, having compassion, not expecting yourself to change everything overnight. And sometimes listening to fix is just great, perfect, all that's needed, it's fine, right? But if you're slowing down enough to notice what would be useful to this person right now, and what would be useful to me right now, and then can I take a breath before I answer?
How do leaders cultivate this kind of environment? Because some of it sounds like taking risk, and like you have to trust, right? And so if you want people around you to be a little bit playful, be willing to experiment, how do you as a leader cultivate that kind of environment and not seem like you don't know what you're doing, right? So it's not, I mean, and I think particularly for women, where there is that notion of, the stained glass ceiling or the glass ceiling, or being the only one, only female in the room, the only woman at the table. And certainly, hopefully as time goes on, we have much less of that, but still, how do we, and I'm being specific about women, how do women cultivate that kind of environment, particularly if you happen to be in a place where your staff is of a different gender? And sometimes we have different ways of leading, right? Different styles of leading, equally effective, but how do you cultivate that kind of environment?
That's such a good question. So I do think, absolutely, I agree with you. It can feel, and it is in certain ways risky to do this, right? And it certainly feels risky. It's very different from how we've been trained about being right, right? It's very different. So I do think a big piece is first really figuring out for yourself, and you might start with trying this for yourself in very small ways to kind of gain confidence that it really works, right? So when I talk about experimenting, one of the ways to think about that is, what are small experiments where if it doesn't work, which I'm putting in quotes because really the purpose of the experiment is to learn. And so either way you're going to learn, but let's say it looks like it fails, right? What's an experiment that's small enough or subtle enough that it can look like it fails and it's not going to matter, so that I can get more comfort and confidence in this process, right? And then as I have confidence, other people are going to pick up on that. Also, to your point about women and men and, not necessarily wanting to come off like, I don't know what I'm doing or like that. going back to I think being explicit about what you're doing and why, and the reason for it, right? Because this is not a thing that we can figure out in the way we might figure out, a complex equation. It's not like that because it involves people or it involves other things that are more complex. So this is actually the only way to do it. And what we're going to do is we're going to get clear about which way we want to move in, and we're going to do it together. But you have to build the confidence yourself that that is actually a reasonable approach to try. And make the experience small enough that you feel like, I can tolerate this level of discomfort.
And when earlier you talked about how important communication is, right?
Yep.
So is it okay just to say, you know what, we're going to try this. It might not work. We might learn, we might decide this is not something we want to do again, but we're just going to kind of work through it. And it's okay if it's not a success. And it's okay if we learn some things here. The goal is to learn some things perhaps that we didn't know. Is it okay to feel as a leader that you can make that kind of space for yourself and others to experiment?
So yeah, it's a great question. So my answer would be this, and each person has to figure out for yourself in your own context, right, what's true. But my answer would be yes, with a caveat. And the caveat is knowing the boundaries, knowing the guardrails, knowing the things. Like, it's not like everything's open for experimentation, right? Like, we're not throwing everything up in the air and being like, we can do anything. Like, that is not what we're up to here. So knowing what are the boundaries that we're going to experiment within, right? If you know the boundaries, if you have the guardrails, then yeah, I think exactly what you just said.
I think we are going to open it up for Q&A now. So anyone who has a question, if you would put your question in Q&A, and Lethelma and I and Wendy will all pop back up when we can, and then we will sort of go with you through these questions. Another question I have, because I noticed that in your description that you are, and I probably should have written it down, but you are an executive coach. And so what that made me wonder is, if I'm new in my career and I need some strategies, I need some ways to think about how do I sort of get my footing in here? How do I align myself so that I'm ready for promotion, so that I'm ready for the next steps? Do you also work with people who are new in their career, or is that a different kind of coach for someone?
Yeah, good question. There are coaches who specialize in working with people at different stages in their careers, at all different stages. So there are people who work with, people who are just out of college. There are people who work with emerging leaders. There are people who work with senior leaders, right? There's people who specialize in everything you can imagine, basically. And there are a lot of coaches who will work with people in a range of roles. So one of the things I've gotten to do in the last 6 months after I left Google is I've been intentionally working with people at different places in their career, which has been super fun, right? So I've been working with some people in their 20s and 30s who are younger in their careers and not in roles that are as senior, and it's super fun to get to work with them in those other spaces. And there's some things about coaching and about leadership that kind of apply across the board universally, and then there's some things that are really specific to a person's context and role and experience. Yeah.
Another question is, just in this COVID environment where things have been so unpredictable, right? It's like a mystery, like a puzzle, like you just keep, and we don't have all the pieces, right?
Yeah.
How should leaders try to stay true to their strategic goals, maybe that they have placed, like within, because I'm sure for many, like, we thought by now we would be way past this, right? And here we are a year later, and we're still in many places dealing with the lingering impacts. So how does one, in the midst of something like this, and I know that you probably haven't had many pandemics that you've had to coach through, right? But in the midst of a pandemic, how do you stay true to the strategic goals and initiatives that you have set for an organization or for a business?
Mm-hmm. So I think you have to take a step back and see which ones still make sense and which ones don't, right? You may have strategic direction that still applies, but your strategies, your goals, your tactics may have to change, right? It just may not look the way it looked before in terms of how you're going to get there. So this is that piece about have a direction, but you may not have an exact destination and a roadmap anymore, right? The roadmap may have to get a lot more flexible. We still know we want to get to here, but the path from here to there may look quite different. So it's knowing what's the piece that's not changing and what are the pieces that might have to.
Okay, let me see. I think, all right, so there is a question here. I'm going to read it. It's a little lengthy. It says, are you familiar with the book Canoeing the Mountains?
No.
Okay.
Sounds good though.
So let's go to the second part. It says, our area churches have used this book before COVID to discuss the Lewis and Clark expedition and how they use these types of strategies in uncharted lands. This applies to churches and the changes in our society. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a recommendation for us to check out Canoeing the Mountains and see how we can apply that to our changing circumstances.
Yeah, that's great. It's a good recommendation. I'll go check it out. It sounds good. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think these principles can apply across a lot of different contexts, right? So whether it's the pandemic, whether it's changing demographics or the ways people interact with religion in their lives or other things, right? Like all of that is a good place to look at how you could apply some of this.
So can you give us the name of the book and author that you used in the beginning of the presentation? I think you mentioned, and then are there other sort of books or resources that you would recommend?
Okay, so the person is Dave Snowden, S-N-O-W-E-N, Dave Snowden. And if you go on YouTube, you can get him talking about his model in depth. There's lots of videos of him. So I'm sure he has books. I haven't read them, so I don't know. But I'm sure he does. I learned it from another organization. But the model is called Canevan, and the spelling and the sound are completely different. So it's, let's see, it's C-Y-N-E-F-I-N, Canevan. Yeah, that's the framework. So if you Google Dave Snowden and Canevan, you'll find it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Linda. We have learned so much. I know I can speak for everyone to say that we feel more equipped to lead. So thank you so much for all of your wisdom.
You're so welcome. It's really a joy to be here with you.
And now we just want you to stay connected to ABWM. Wendy, will you put up the slide for us? Yes, thank you. We want you to attend our next webinar, which will be March 18th. We are going to be talking about the value of a breath vaping in our youth. So we would love to see you again on March 18th. So please register at abwomensministries.org/webinars. And please stay connected to us on social media. We have Facebook, AB Women's Ministries, Twitter, AB Women. Also, ABWM continues to provide intentional leadership development opportunities for all generations through our webinar series. As you know, this webinar was free of charge. Please us to continue to provide free resources by making a generous gift to ABWM. You can give by Venmo, AB Women's Ministries, give by text, or give online by credit card. And you can also give by check by mailing it to our office. All the information is on the slide. Thank you so much for your generosity.
It has truly been a joy, Linda. We thank you again. I I never thought of breathing in the way that you named it as superpower. So, but I know that it is. We actually did that recently before a taping that we had to do. We just paused to breathe, and it's amazing how sometimes the day goes by and you really don't take that moment. Mm-hmm. So, thank you for giving us some freedom and how we think about problem solving, about how we think about leading in difficult or complicated situations. We're really grateful for that. Thank you, everyone who joined us tonight. We hope we'd see you at our next webinar, which is not this Thursday, but the following Thursday. We're every other Thursday. So we thank you for coming to that. And we thank you just for taking the time to go on our website. So again, so happy that you were here with us this evening. And we hope that you will be at other events that are coming forward under the ABWM ministry. And now I will close us out with a word of prayer. God, we ask that you open our ears so that we can hear, that you open our minds and our hearts so that we can receive the blessings that you have for us. Let us go forth, Lord, with some freedom and a willingness to experiment. Let us try different things. Remind us, Lord, that you have all the answers, but we don't need to have all the answers. We thank you, Lord, for your abundance. We ask you, Lord, that in this Lenten season, that you will continue to take us deeper and deeper in our relationship with you. We pray this prayer in the matchless name of Jesus. Amen.